retrogrades. Back in December, 3 months ago, December of 2024, following President Biden's commutation of 37 federal death sentences, one of his last acts as president, the USCCB, our American Conference of Catholic Bishops, expressed gratitude and reiterated its long-standing call for the abolition of the death penalty. They've become liberals on this for the last 2 generations, if not 3. They emphasized the importance of building a culture of life and compassion. Of course, the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, had clarified as recently as 2004 under Cardinal Ratzinger, future Pope Benedict, that life issues only includes abortion and euthanasia. It does not include the application of war or the death penalty. These are not life issues simpliciter. Well, I was sitting in Latin Mass on Sunday in my nearest Latin Mass parish, and God bless the Louisiana bishop who had kept that in place, who was the Archdiocese of New Orleans. And that I do want to express filial gratitude to Most Reverend Gregory Amon, Archbishop of New Orleans, for keeping the Latin Mass in place. But all of the bishops of Louisiana together had a letter read at Mass. Louisiana listeners of this show will recognize it. And they claimed that, look, we've consistently defended life from conception to natural death. We remain deeply aware of the pain and grief that victims and families suffer, especially those who have lost a loved one through the crime of murder or crimes of violence. Yet as we continue to pray for the victims and their families, we pray that the state will not usher in a culture of death, as if the death penalty does this, by facilitating death warrants, and consider that mercy can be the highest form of justice. No method of execution is acceptable, including nitrogen hypoxia. As a result of the recent efforts to restart the protocols for executions, the Louisiana Conference of Catholic Bishops circulated the following statement. We are sad. This is what was circulated at church. We are saddened by the recent notice to restart the process for the issuance of death warrants to execute human beings in Louisiana. This only contributes to the culture of death. We promote a culture of life, not death, in this great state we love. As bishops, we will continue to promote life from conception to natural death and work to end the execution of another human being. Now, and this is signed by Most Reverend Gregory Amon, Archbishop of New Orleans, whom I just thanked sincerely. Most Reverend Michael Duca, the Diocese of Baton Rouge. Most Reverend Douglas Deschotels, Diocese of Lafayette. Most Reverend Francis Malone, Diocese of Shreveport. And the Most Reverend Robert Marshall, Diocese of Alexandria, along with the Diocese of Lake Charles Bishop Provost, and the Diocesan Administrator, Simon Peter Angurite. So, look, I understand that there can be well-intention around this issue of the death penalty. For the last couple of generations, the church has falsely categorized it as a life issue, even though as recently as 21 years ago, CDF Ratzinger said it's not. He explicitly wrote it is not a life issue. There's legitimate room for disagreement among Catholics with the Holy Father on the application of the death penalty and the application of just war theory, because these are not mala in se. They're not evils in themselves. The whole Catholic tradition of the death penalty proves that it's actually a conditional good. Aquinas makes this really clear. Pretty much both testaments make it as clear as you could ever want it. It's a good thing. By man shall his blood be shed as a punishment. Almost all of the patristics, including Augustine, Aquinas, everyone up until the last century who was anyone in Roman Catholicism as a theologian, supported the death penalty. So this is a very recent thing. Now, what today's show is going to be about is a proof, and this is in the strictest terms, a proof that the recent amendments to Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2267, involves an actual fallacy heresy, a proof. And remember, we had the 1993-94 version, paragraph 2267, I'll read you that, where the death penalty is still in effect. Not 3.5 years later, Pope John Paul II, the same one who had just issued the first universal catechism for the first time in 450 years, issues an amendment on his own catechism 3 years later. It's just really weird. That 1997 amendment to paragraph number 2267 is quite literally the source of all the trouble. Then, of course, in 2019, Francis issued an amendment of the amendment of 2267, and that made things even clearer. Let me read those to you as soon as I give a few shout outs. Number one, if you like this show, please help us reach our subscriber count of 100,000. Click subscribe, click the notification bell. Thank you. And if you want to support the show, do so on Locals, the Locals link, where you get cool stuff and you get stuff early for becoming a Locals supporter. If you want to just donate, because, you know, difficulties with my first daughter, or, you know, people ask this all the time, go to timothyjgordon.com, or you can send stuff to my P.O. box on the website. If you want to support yourself, the best way to do so is to get out of a blue state, get to a red state, go to www.realestateforlife.org, and a pro-life, pro-Catholic person will help you get out of your blue state and get to a red state like I did. Okay, so that's that. Special announcement for tonight is we have on the Retrograde Classical Academy a new live class coming up. It's over the course of 8 weeks. I think you'll take 1 week off there. 7 courses. It's called Why Am I Still Single? And it's being taught by Jillian Curvers. We did a show the other day. Fascinating stuff. Breakthroughs in personality, including complex trauma and self-image issues as Catholics. What do we make of all this stuff? Why am I still single? It's a great course. It's free. And it begins tonight. There's already about 85 people enrolled, and it's quite dynamite. We ran through this, just barely touched on the 7 topics in the last episode of the show, Jill and I. But she's going to go for an in-depth look at each of these. It begins tonight. What do I need to say? Go to timothyjgordon.com. What else am I missing?
timothyjgordon.com. If you can't make live class, we do, when you enroll, you do have access to the recordings. So if you just want to watch the recordings and not attend live class, that's an option. And as of right now, I think 130 people are in the class.
So like 50 joined since last time I looked.
Some people
45.
were even asking who are in relationships. They're like, can I just listen? And so so it's open to everybody. It's focused to single Catholics, but really everyone can listen in if they'd like to. So timothyjgordon.com, hit classes, Why Am I Single workshop.
It's dynamite stuff. It's not touchy-feely. It's scientific, and it's anthropologically correct from a Catholic perspective. So, and what time does that class begin tonight? CST?
I'm not sure, but I think it's 6.
I think it's 6 CST.
I'm not
Double
sure,
check us on timothyjgordon.com. That begins tonight. Okay, so what I'm going to do in today's episode is furnish a real proof that JP2's self-amendment to his own recent catechism, the 1997 amendment to the 1993-94 catechism, led us down this path of errors that Francis would capitalize on to, as an eventuality, say that the death penalty is inadmissible. Now, we're going to talk about this term inadmissible. A lot of people did 5 or 6 years ago when he first issued it. It's a non-theological term, and that was intentional. So remember, here's a few. I found this article on Catholic Digest called Closer Look at the Catechism's Revised Teaching on Capital Punishment by Pat Gone, circulated shortly after Francis's revision to the revision in 2019. It's dynamite because what I wanted to find that's a little difficult to find is what was the original CCC 2267 in 94? What was the one as it was left in 97? I know this because I've written on it extensively, written some white papers on it. But I always forget the exact verbiage of the 94 version, and they just get hard to find because it's like a palimpsest. They're just erased out of history. And kind of, get out your eraser. 2267 doesn't say this. Now it says this in 1997. Then 20 years later, 22 years later in 2019. No, well, now it says this. Something even more lenient, even more strict on the usage of capital punishment. But I found this article on Catholic Digest that's dynamite. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to go through. They have the language lined out and some good commentary on why the amendments to the amendments. In August 2018, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith announced Pope Francis's approved revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church with regard to paragraph 2267 on the use of the death penalty. This revision declares that the death penalty is inadmissible, non-theological term, never been used in this discourse before, because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. You're probably reasonably familiar with this, or you've at least heard it once or twice before. It reflects the Church's enormous emphasis on respecting all human life. It also fosters the deep hope that no one is beyond God's mercy, and there is always a chance for repentance, even for those convicted of capital crimes. Well, of course. It's been proven that the odds of some act of contrition or incomplete repentance on death row is 1 in 4 or 1 in 3. And those numbers drop to basically zero, asymptotically zero, when they live out a life without an expiry date. So this claim, there's always a chance for repentance, even though for those convicted of capital crimes, is actually a much, 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 much stronger claim when the death penalty is applied. When someone knows I'm going to the electric chair on Friday, I can't remember because I didn't review these numbers. It's either 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 of those convicted, accused, whatever you want to call them, cons, who are going to the death penalty on death row will give some sort of act or acknowledgement of sorrow for their guilt. The number is nearly zero when you take away that expiry date. When you say, oh, we're applying mercy, this secular humanist mercy where no one can ever be killed by the death penalty, even though the Old Testament says it's necessary, New Testament says it's good. All of the doctors, aside from maybe one, say it's an affirmative good thing, and no one questioned it until the 20th century. Well, the proof is in the pudding. It's either 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 3 of those going to their deaths will make some act which can actually redeem them. Those who just are allowed to live out the rest of their lives will not get such a chance. I mean, they'll have forever, they'll have as many years to live as Providence affords them without an early death, the early death of punishment. And what happens then? The numbers drop to zero. Recidivism rates for homicidists in California are like 7%. But even if you don't repeat your crime, without an expiry date, and Thomas Aquinas talks about this in the Summa, without an expiry date, these people will likely never make a big turnaround. If you're ever trying to have a major inflection point in your life with really, really bad habits, you need something big. You need some big deadline. You need something to help you turn around the negative momentum. Okay. So what Francis did in summer of 2019 was a revision to a revision. I've already mentioned this. I'm trying to leap into topics a little better. I like to do intros, but I'm trying to leap a little faster. Pope Francis's update, this Mr. Goen says, is it's Pat, so I don't know if it's a guy or a girl, is not the first that this particular text has received. Let's review its history. The paragraph in question, I'm still reading from Goen's article, paragraph 2267, is found under the article that deals with the fifth commandment, you shall not kill, from Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Now, all over Exodus, it's affirmed that it's thou shalt not murder. The death penalty is good. As a matter of fact, by man shall your blood be shed. God says you really need to apply the death penalty. Jesus affirms the use of the death penalty to Pontius Pilate in John's gospel, and he says the power of a procurator to kill comes from God. This is called literally the oh my gosh, why am I blanking out what it's called? This is called the prerogative of the state. Okay. The Catechism discusses three areas that must be held in tension when considering the practical implications for this commandment: respect for human life, respect for human dignity, and respect for safeguarding the peace. I'm going to prove to you today why respect for safeguarding the peace is so problematic. It's actually problematic. Actually turns into a form of Catholic consequentialism when we think that we can punish a murderer not for the sake of retributivism itself, the principle, but just to get something, because we're worried potentially, well, there's a 7% chance he might kill again if he gets out on parole later if we don't kill him. Think about that. If the death penalty is not by its principle just, if it's not just simpliciter, and it's an unjust thing, and we're only using it because, hey, 7%, I looked this up before I debated Trent Horn, I still remember, 7% of murderers in California will repeat their crime once they get out. Now, it's unjust to kill these people, murderers, according to the liberals, but you're going to see the first revision by Pope John Paul II, which says even though it's unjust to kill them, you can kill basically those you feel you need to, even though it's unjust, to get at those 7%. That means you don't know who the 7% who will recede will be, but if you kill any number of the other 93% unjustly, then, well, that's fine. That doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to kill any murderers who are guilty, accused, went through procedural due process. I'm saying, in principle, it's correct to kill 100% of murderers. This is what Thomas teaches, what the Catholic Church has always taught. But I'm showing the fallacy, I'll do it in more explicit terms, of saying the death penalty is unjust, but we can use it, even though it's unjust, to kill a broad swath of murderers because 7% of them will recede. More on that later. When the English version of the Catechism of the Catholic Church was first presented in 94, I think the original version came out in late 93. That's why we say 93, 94. The text of 2267 read as follows. This is, first catechism since Trent, Universal Catechism. If bloodless means are sufficient to defend human lives against an aggressor and to protect public order and the safety of persons, public authority should limit itself to such means because they better correspond to the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. The text shows that while the death penalty was permissible, it should mostly be used as a last resort, if at all, Goen says. Now, strangely enough, just 3 years later, the same Pope corrected his same Universal Catechism. You go 450 years without a Universal Catechism, and now you're already correcting your own new one 3 years later? What's going on? What kind of UN international, political pressure was being applied there? Who knows what's really being applied to make these guys do this stuff. When the second edition of the Catechism came out in 97, JP2 amended and expanded this text. While acknowledging that previous teaching did not exclude the death penalty, the legitimacy of capital punishment as a necessity was further decried as practically non-existent. So he uses this term practically non-existent, that it's ever, and this is where the error comes in. There's not really an error in the 94 version, even though it's sort of implied, because they're going soft. When you go soft on the death penalty and you go halfway and you say, well, you can use it, but you can only use it to protect other human lives, you end up creating and employing a fallacy that violates Catholic teaching on something called consequentialism. You may not do evil so that good may come from it. I'll explain more later, but here's what it gets revised to in 97 by the same guy who had promulgated. Assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, you're never 100%. It's always, 99. The traditional teaching of the church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty if this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. So see, he's leaning more and more heavily, JP2 is, into the consequentialist reasoning. Death penalty's wrong. He's going more toward what Francis will eventually do in 22 years. It's wrong, but you can do it if it's the only way of avoiding an outcome that you don't like, more innocent people being killed. If, however, non-lethal means, this is still 97's revision, if, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means, as these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. I just read for you real statistics. Somewhere between a third and a fourth of all people on death row will make some imperfect act or perfect act of contrition. It's been shown. There's lots of stats on this. Those people, as Thomas Aquinas says, they will presumably never make that act because they make it at the last minute, right? So if you just live a natural life with a natural death, you don't have an expiry date. You can die in your sleep. You can die sort of insensate on your deathbed. But the people who are given the death penalty are given actually a gift that none of the rest of us are. I know that sounds strange. It's not, though. They're given a discrete moment in time to say, okay, I gotta get right with God. I have to get right with God. No one else has that. They licitly have that because it's licit to put these people to death. Here's the final one. Today, in fact, as a consequence of the... So, I interjected there because the dignity of the human person is, by the stats, the numbers I'm showing, this is just an aside, proven to be enhanced by the use of the death penalty. More of those people on death row are going to go to heaven eventually than the number of people who might have been on death row once but then were pardoned and they live out long natural lives. It's a certainty. If you care about their dignity, you give them this chance. And they're a special class of people. They've committed the worst crime in civil society. So, and the Bible says you can do it. It's okay, give them this grace. Give them the grace of death, as Thomas Aquinas calls it. That enhances their dignity. It preserves it. Just not giving them the punishment that's due to them, ordered by retributivism, proportionality, means more of them are going to wind up in hell. They're like, oh, great, I'm off the hook. And then they never end up making that, a third to a fourth of them never end up making that act of contrition. Here's the final paragraph of the 97 revision. Today, in fact, is a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing the crime. This is really, really the hot spot. By rendering one who has committed an offense incapable of doing harm, without definitely taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself. But that's wrong. The cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Oh boy, there's so much error in this one little paragraph by John Paul II. And remember, he was sort of being, we now know through things like books like Windswept House and Father Elijah and just the history of the late 90s, he was basically being run out of office by the Sankt Gallen Mafia. So who knows if this was even his idea. That's what I meant to insinuate when I'm like, why would you amend your own catechism 3 years later? There hadn't been one in 5 centuries. An amendment 3 years later is bizarre. I mean, it's already been more than 3. It's already been twice as many, 6 years since Francis did it. If someone's like, let's amend his back to, let's get the death penalty, you know, they'd be like, well, this is new. This is the newest teaching of the church. No, it's 6 years old. That's twice as old as the teaching was when JP2 amended it. So let's just go through. I want to come back to this amendment by JP2. But first, let's read the latest update to 2267. Francis wanted it even more inadmissible. The rumor among those who know is that Francis was going to use correct theological language, the language of lyceity. You may never use it, wrong in principle, until someone got him or his immediate minions Phaser and Bisset's book, By Man Shall His Blood Be Shed. So good, tip of the hat to Phaser and Bisset, because by allegedly tipping the scales just enough to make him use the theological term inadmissible, because history and tradition wouldn't allow Francis to use the word illicit or wrong in principle. That would have been a correctable heresy, basically. He switched at the last minute to inadmissible, which no one knew what it meant. So the latest update, and it's so verbose, they always get longer. Recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. The funny thing is, I don't really have that many issues with Francis's revision. I mean, there are issues, but I have more with JP2's. But it's just funny when you read Francis writing. I wasn't even planning on saying anything about this one because I want to go back to the 97 version. That's where I have all the technical know-how in moral philosophy. It's just funny. He talks in a way no pope has ever talked. Recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes. It's just the historical critical coming out party with Francis, isn't it? You can just say, oh, a lot of people, it was long thought that Christ was God or whatever, JP2 doesn't talk like that, even though he was the theological liberal. He doesn't talk like that. Oh, people long thought this, but it's the 21st century. Next paragraph. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. Never said that the dignity of the person was lost, right? Why are we even talking about this? No, the dignity of the person speaking the way he's speaking cannot be lost, and the dignity of the person, as I've proven with those statistics, is enhanced if you mean the ability to restore unity with God by going to heaven. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. There's that second phrase. A new understanding. This is as old as time. There's no technological development to the understanding of the 4 justifications for punishment. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. So he's making the same error that JP2 is here. It's not taking away the possibility of redemption to give someone a death date. It is enhancing the possibility consistent with their personal dignity when they have an expiry date. But also, what about because the number of murders inside prisons is super, super high. It's super high. It's far higher than the rate of recidivism in most or all states. Rate of recidivism, if these people get paroled, is like 5, 6, 7%. Rate of murder inside prisons is much higher than that. So do JP2 and Francis just not care about the people that have to live with these dangerous murderers? What if you're in prison for tax evasion or something? You just have to live under the constant risk of being killed in prison. The risk is really, really high. And the technological enhancements to the prison system have done nothing to curb that. Consequently, the church teaches in the light of the gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. Okay, so that's Francis's. People critiqued it a lot. It's really silly. He has a funny way of talking, as he always does. And, you know, he'd given this little call for mercy in 2015. Said, today capital punishment is unacceptable. This is before he came out with his amendment. However serious the condemned crime may have been, it is an offense to the inviolability of life and of innocent life, not all life. Inviolability of life and to the dignity of the human person, which contradicts God's plan for man and for society and for his merciful justice, even though St. Paul says it is called for by God. How does it contradict what God says when St. Paul says God calls for it? Jesus himself says it to Pontius Pilate. It's all over the book of Exodus that it is God's plan to have death penalty. By man shall his blood be shed. What are they talking about? They're just playing on the ignorance of people. People are like, yeah, sounds mean. It fails to conform to any just purpose of punishment. That's just not true. No moral theologian, no moral philosopher has ever said it fails all four tests, justifications for punishment. And this is what Francis couldn't get around. It is in principle, in proportionalism, retributivism, it is absolutely correct. It does not render justice to the victims, but rather foments revenge. That's not true. It has always been contrasted against revenge because it's in the hands of the state, who has the prerogative directly from God. Jesus says this to Pilate, and it's been said in all moral philosophy for 20 years. 20 millenniums, sorry. Okay, but let's go back to this language, the third paragraph of JP2's 97 amendment. This is where it really gets off track. I don't really care so much about Francis's more recent revision. Let's go back to this one paragraph in 1997 where JP2 oddly decided to, this is a mystery, correct himself from, less than a presidential term before. 3 years before, he promulgates the CCC, and now less than a presidential term later, he's changing again. Why not just put this in the 94 version? Today, in fact, is a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing crime by rendering one who has committed an offense incapable of doing harm without definitely taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself. The cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent. The previous paragraph in the 97 revision is also important. But first, let me just say this. The state has, for effectively preventing crime, the state doesn't have any means of effectively preventing crime now that they didn't have before. I mean, I would have asked the Holy Father, have you seen American crime statistics in inner cities? Black on black crime, brown on brown crime, it is sky high. What are you talking about? The state can't, it would curb this if it could. We talking Minority Report here, the Tom Cruise movie where they go in with technology and use like time machine and time psychoanalysis to figure out who's going to become a murderer. What the hell? It's so odd that they pass this stuff off and they're like, yep, this is good. Publish it. There's no way the state can prevent, especially violent crime. Come to America. Without definitely taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself. We've been through this a couple times. I'll repeat it one more time. More people will be redeemed on death row than off death row, than murderers who are not on death row. Between 25 and 33% of all death row people make some sort of act of apology or sorry. ecumenist like Pope John Paul II should say, hey, you know, they might not all be Catholic, but an ecumenist like that should be like, well, this is good enough if they're Protestant or not anything at all. I mean, I'm not going to get into the theology of what a non-Catholic has to do to say sorry. It's you know, it's still kind of bleak, but they have a better shot if they make an imperfect act. But so there's that. So it's got to be absolutely necessary, and it's very rare, it's if not practically non-existent. So what he means by necessary here is to save an innocent life who would fall victim to recidivism, repeating murder, if said murderer was let out on parole. That's where the second paragraph is a little more specific, the paragraph before this one, where it reads, if, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means as these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. So this is just silliness to be talking about the dignity of the human person again in these terms. But so here we have it. So what JP2 has explicitly outlined, I'm going to go through my an actual outline on a white paper I wrote, which proves it, is that if, even though the death penalty is, he's no longer willing to announce that it's correct in principle. Phaser makes this, well, it's always correct in principle. Sometimes as applied, you know, leniency can be granted. Maybe leniency, Phaser even acknowledges, should be granted most of the time. I don't tend to agree with first-degree murderers, having seen what I've seen studying the criminal law and stuff. But you could, there's not a theological problem. As long as you say it's correct in principle to kill, then a lenient state can enforce the death penalty far less. A more stringent state could enforce it up to 100% of the time, where the requirements of proportionality are met, and then boom, yeah, this in different states will do differently. But that all flows from the fact that you have to state as a Catholic, to be consistent with the tradition and the magisterium and the scripture, that the death penalty is always just in principle. As applied, different states will use it different ways. Well,
people are asking if this paper that you're talking about is online. Where can they get it?
No, it's not online. This is a paper I wrote for a doctoral program. I was thinking of doing this as a dissertation. I'm giving you an outline, the outline that I turned in for the class. I'm like, I'm not going to read the whole paper. No, but so here's I'm going to read the outline directly. In the updated 97 version of the CCC, number 2267, in conformity with Pope John Paul II's statements on the death penalty in Evangelium Vitae, paragraph 56, it reads, that passage I just read. I guess I'll read it one more time. The traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude, presupposing full ascertainment of the identity and responsibility of the offender, recourse to the death penalty when this is the only practicable way to defend the lives of human beings effectively against the aggressor. This is actually the first paragraph of 3, so I'm glad I reread it. I was reading you the second and the third. So what I italicized here is when the recourse to the death penalty is not excluded, when this is the only practicable way to defend the lives of human beings effectively against the aggressor. So he's effectively denying that it's correct to kill using the death penalty in principle. He makes it explicit here. When this is the only practicable way to prevent further loss of life. So you see the basic problematic already? It's not in principle correct to use the death penalty, but you can do it if you think it's going to save lives. Well, now you're getting into minority report territory. Okay, here's the next point. Showing that neither the principle of double effect, you got two possible theories for a provision in the Catechism like this. Both of them fail. So I'm saying it just must be wrong. Showing that neither the principle of double effect, which I'll walk you through, nor consequentialist reasoning will justify this clause, concluding 2267. I will work analytically backward toward the conclusion that the sole justification for the death penalty must be the principle of retributivism in the hands of due public authority, which is what the church had truly always taught. The clause must be understood then permissively rather than mandatorily, meaning, JP2's new stuff he's saying in 97 can be used to permit more lenient states not to use the death penalty all the time, but it can't be mandatory. You can't make the more stringent states not use it because it's always correct in principle. If it's not always correct in principle, then you're not allowed to use it to save lives. That's the thrust of the argument, but I'll get a little more specific and I can show it to you. I can sort of prove it. More lenient public authorities may choose to apply the death penalty primarily to defend the lives of speculative future victims against aggressors, but more stringent public authorities may licitly choose to apply the death penalty universally to all murderers because the principle of retributism, the principle of, basically proportional justice, justifies it in every case. So this is the only hermeneutic for the 97 Catechism. It's basically wrong what he wrote, but I'm saying you have to use a hermeneutic of, apply 97 Catechism leniently. The condition, the sine qua non for continued use of the death penalty according to the 97 revision in 2267 comes from these words: when this is the only practicable way to defend the lives of human beings effectively against the aggressor. This must be justified either by the principle of double effect or by a sort of Catholic consequentialism, where you're allowed to do evil in order to achieve some good. There's no other theory which could justify this clause in the 97 Catechism besides A, the principle of double effect. I'll show you why that fails. And B, a sort of Catholic consequentialism, which is just always denied to us. You can't bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You can't bomb innocents at Nagasaki and Hiroshima the way the U.S. did because, that's an evil. You're never allowed to attack innocents. Now, collateral damage is a different thing. This gets into trolley car moral philosophy problems. But you're never allowed to intend the deaths of innocent people. That's the long-standing Catholic moral teaching. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki were intentional targeting of innocents in order to scare them into ending the war. Well, millions, everyone's sort of greatest gen, not boomer, greatest gen grandpa would justify that, it saved millions to murder all these Japanese. Well, you're not allowed to murder even one to save millions. You can kill soldiers. You can accidentally kill civilians as you're intending to kill soldiers. That's called collateral damage. It's been justified throughout the whole tradition. You may not intend to kill wantonly civilians as the U.S. did at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Can't do it. It's open and shut. It's very, very clear. And that's Catholic, that would be consequentialism. The church has always condemned these things. Yeah, that's right. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were very, very, very evil. So, must either be justified by principle of double effect or by Catholic consequentialism. Now, the principle of double effect is the principle by which you are allowed, even though you do not hold the power of God to intend a killing. That's called the prerogative. God gives that power to the states, the legitimate authority that JP2 keeps referring to. If it's a monarchy, the king. If it's aristocracy, the oligarchs. If it's a polity, to the Congress. Legitimate authority according to whatever good regime you're a part of. They can decide to use the prerogative of the state because it's the power of God to kill murderers. It's justified in principle, so you can always do it. But if someone breaks into your house, you're a private citizen. You don't hold the prerogative of the state. How is it justified to kill someone who breaks into your house to harm you and your family. Here's how. The principle of double effect. Because form is specified by intent. This gets very technical, but form is specified by intent. So if someone breaks in and you shoot him, I mean, you shoot him for center of mass, as any firearms instructor will teach you. You're still not intending to take a life. You're intending to defend yourself and your family, which is good. There are foreseeable but unintended consequences, meaning it's 100% foreseeable. You're aiming fire for center of mass at someone, at the person that broke into your house and is raising his arm to kill you or your loved ones. Perfectly foreseeable, you're kind of hoping 100% that you strike them down, but this is still not an intended killing. It's not an intended killing. Well, how's that? Because it's hard for non-philosophers to understand, but there are foreseeable yet unintended consequences with the principle of double effect. What is the two effects? Well, you're protecting you and your family, which is good. The unintended effect is that you're killing this would-be murderer. Now, conditions apply to the principle of double effect. Like if they are having second thoughts and they lower their arm and they're walking away and their back is to you, both legally and morally in most states. This is all common law stuff, so it varies some state by state. But legally and more importantly, morally, if they're walking away from you, you no longer can licitly shoot them under the auspices of the principle of double effect. You can't do it. You simply can't do it. Because the exigency, the circumstances which afford the exigency for you to be trying, what are you really intending? What is the first effect you're going for, you're really intending? Oh, I'm trying to preserve my life and my family's. That's gone. Your life and your family's will be preserved no matter what. So it's only one effect, and by dint of implication, if you shoot someone who's walking away from you that had second thoughts, now that the conditions are no longer furnished, it's proof that you're just intending to kill them. There's no second effect. So exigency is really important because you're not ever allowed to intend the killing privately of another person. Okay. That's very, very important. And I hope you understand that. So principle of double effect fails to qualify as a viable justification for the death penalty for two reasons. Historically and philosophically, the dispensation of the death penalty by public authority when it's due must have been regarded as an affirmative good rather than a second effect, an evil second effect, which is a PDE thing, a principle of double effect thing, being tolerated in light of a first good effect. Contrastingly, homicidal self-defense, when you do commit homicide in self-defense of you or your family, by private citizens relies upon the principle of double effect for the reasons I kind of described, but only in cases of clear imminent danger. When the danger's gone, the PDE excuse to use it is gone, you see? Further, the PDE was activated only by their lack of due public authority. You don't need the principle of double effect if you have due public authority. It's literally the state may intend with the prerogative of God to kill innocent people. You as a private citizen may not intend to kill even the guy who broke into your house. You're only allowed to intend to defend yourself. Now here's the second thing. By even prescinding from the question of due public authority, the PDE, principle of double effect, would not apply in cases of implementation of the death penalty since it involves prior anticipatory action by the state, antecedent to the sort of clear imminent danger posed by aggressors contemplated in a house break-in situation. It's anticipatory. The state, so in other words, if the state were relying on the principle of double effect, it would fail. Thank goodness the state, for all these millennia where the state was using the death penalty, was not relying on the principle of double effect. But if it were, it would fail. Why? Because the state's like, we're going to kill this guy. He's behind bars now, But if we don't kill him, he'll eventually get out on parole, and maybe there's a 7% chance kill again. Well, so that's an intended killing. That fails that imminency, exigency requirement of the principle of double effect. So if the state had to rely on the principle of double effect in order to kill guilty accused murderers, it would fail the most important prong. The state is intending anticipatorily to kill while these people are detained, while they're behind bars. There's no danger of them killing anybody. Think about that. It's striking. And JP2 assumes that this is the justification that the state has to kill in the 97 Catechism. He explicitly assumes it. Or if he's not assuming PDE, the principle of double effect, which fails here, then he's assuming just outright Catholic consequentialism, which is a contradiction in terms. So let's instead examine that now that we've seen that principle of double effect fails for the 97 Catechism revision as a justifying legal theory, moral and legal theory. Does the 97 teaching on the death penalty represent an instance where a presumptive moral evil, the death penalty, which now they're assuming is bad, informs a means to achieve a good end, the protection of prospective innocent lives outside of prison? Well, what would that involve? Let's think about what that would involve. It's an evil means to achieve a good end. We're not allowed to do that, right? Like we said about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Given the anticipatory nature of the punishment, if the death penalty were to be applied against all convicted murderers in a state with, say, a 7% rate of murder recidivism, that's what it was in California when I conceived of this, then it would seem to represent the means of killing 93% of murderers who will not murder again in order to achieve the end of neutralizing the 7% of murderers in that state who are projected to murder again in the future. I mean, because you don't know which ones will, right? So you're trying to apply JP2's seemingly merciful words, and you're just butchering, according to him, without a rectitude in principle of the death penalty. You're illicitly butchering all of these ones you suspect, only 7% of which will recede to murder once outside of prison. Because it's like a Minority Report thing, like the Tom Cruise movie. You don't know. So he's created a contradiction in terms in an unsupportable system. You can't do that. You can't kill the 93% in order to get at the 7% unless the state held some right to put to death guilty accused that they got directly from God in the first place, which it did. And unless retributivism were licit or justifiable in the first place, which it is. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying JP2 and Francis will say it's not. And so they're the ones that are either having to rely on PDE or consequentialism, both of which are not open to them. This would be a means toward end reasoning, which is rejected, expressly rejected by the church. Conceivably, I'm trying to be, deferent here. Conceivably, as yet unimagined justifications for the 97 Catechism revision, the clause, when this is the only practicable way to defend the lives of human beings effectively against the aggressor, might exist. I can't think of what they would be. The only ones that seem like they exist out there would be principle of double effect and some sort of licit Catholic consequentialism. Catholic consequentialism is always a contradiction in terms. But eliminating the two primary candidates for legal theories which would justify the limitation strongly insinuates the permissive, rather than mandatory interpretation of the 97 Amendment, which appears to be philosophically incoherent if you try to make it a mandatory proviso. And that's precisely what Francis assumes, that it's a mandatory proviso, and then he bulwarks it with 2019, 22 years later. A fortiori, the principle of retributivism is in the hands of due public authority, appears to justify universal application of the death penalty against all murderers, whether or not they will ever threaten to commit another such crime. And that's the truth. The state can put to death all murderers because of the right that God gives in the Old Testament and New Testament, and because of the right which he gives through the natural law, through the fact that this is proportional punishment. So you can't do what JP2 and Francis did, where they just said, all we're doing is trying to protect innocent life. That ends up being a mortal sin. To put to death a murderer just to protect innocent life. So I would, and this is the argument I used against Trent Horn when we debated the death penalty. I'm like, you have to either be misunderstanding the principle of double effect, which doesn't apply to the state using the death penalty, or you have to be saying consequentialism is right. You may do evil, against 93% non-recidivists in order to achieve some end against, the 7% of murderers who will recede to murder. So that's in my mind a sort of categorical proof. And I would ask the bishops before they, continue on their high horse against the whole Catholic tradition, I would ask them to consider it, because you're not going to get around this reasoning. And I can't fathom what would be another justification for the death penalty to be wrong or inadmissible in principle. I guess Francis never quite said it, but both he and JP2 are insinuating that it's wrong in principle, but sometimes good. It's like a mixture of consequentialism and the principle of double effect. That's not how moral philosophy works. You have to check all the boxes. Okay. Are there any questions there, or are we... It's a pretty tight argument.
Somebody mentioned earlier, let me find it. It was in regards, I think we've all heard the saying from conception to natural death. Well, if the death penalty is part of the natural law, could we consider the death penalty a natural law or a natural death?
No, it's not a natural death just because it's, but we don't believe that that's an unqualified expression. We don't believe in the occlusion of all killing from conception to natural death. That's just not true. We believe in the occlusion of killing innocent life from conception to natural death. And conception means no abortion. Natural death means no euthanasia. As, there's a short document from 2004 where Cardinal Ratzinger clarified this really, really satisfyingly. So, we don't have to make stretches like that, like, natural death is that natural law, and nothing like that. All you have to do is say, it's innocent life that is protected from conception to natural death, not guilty accused. Okay?
Very good.
Anything else? If you're interested in that class tonight, join up. I think it's 6 p.m. Go to timothyjgordon.com, and it's good stuff. Why am I still single?
Oh, sorry. People wanted you to do a reaction video to the Lila Rose video. Why the trad wife life, myth versus reality.
I mean, maybe I will. I just feel like the reaction videos are very Michael Lofton. I'd rather just debate her. And I asked her to debate, and she said she wanted to take all comers. And then, and I retweeted it just last night. Lila, I'd love to debate you on this. One time I was doing a show on some related topic, and she was popping in the comments and saying, hey, Tim, I think you're misunderstanding this. I'm like, well, why don't we just debate it so we can really sort it out? Maybe I'll do that. It just always feels like a cop-out. I also don't really like debating girls.
Yeah.
Feels a bit like one-on-one basketball against girls, but it's better than just a reaction video. Maybe I will. Who knows?
Yeah.
Anyway, God bless you all. Thanks for watching. I think this is a really, really tight argument, and let me know if you can poke any holes in it. It's kind of like the scholar's mate proof against sola scriptura I came up with came up with these in this philosophy program. It's still technically a part of doctoral program, and I don't think there's any way to poke any holes in them. But let me know if you think you do. God bless you all. Get in that Why Am I Still Single class. Starts tonight at 6. God bless.